You're listening to a CNA podcast. Where are you right now? Are you commuting to work? Maybe you're listening to this podcast at the gym. Whatever the case, I know some of you would probably rather be here.
Reconnect, rejuvenate, refresh, rekindle, relive. In the world's leading destination, where islands are naturally distanced and surrounded by white sandy beaches and turquoise waters. Don't stop dreaming about Maldives. We are waiting for you to come back.
That's one of dozens of promotional videos by Visit Maldives. But let's be honest, you don't really need to do much convincing to get people to this dream destination. It's more of an affordability question than anything else. CNA recently took a trip to this sprawling archipelago, but not for a holiday. Correspondent Afifah Ariffin traveled there to explore not only its waters, but also its geopolitical place in the world today. I'm Teresa Tang. Let's get started. Hi, Afifah.
Hi, Teresa. Good morning.
What an incredible work opportunity. You know, when you were told this would be your next assignment, how excited were you, honestly, on a scale of 1 to 10? Let's start there.
I was so stoked. It's so funny how life pans out sometimes because back in 2008, my extended family, so all of my cousins, they all went to the Maldives for a diving trip. So they got their basic sets there. They even went on a submarine ride, and there were so many pictures and videos of them jumping into the water from the villa. And I was stuck in Singapore because I was sitting for my A-level examinations. And I was so jealous because everyone got to go there and have so much fun. And so the Maldives had been on my bucket list for a really long time. So fast forward about 15 years later, we were discussing with our editors, brainstorming new ideas for the East Asia Tonight Bulletin. And we wanted to showcase China's growing influence around the world, especially outside of where we live here in Southeast Asia. We threw out a lot of regions. The Middle East was one, but the logistics and timings didn't quite work out for that. So then we pivoted to look at the Indian Ocean, and we wanted to zoom in on the Maldives. So yeah, it took me a long way, but finally got there in the end.
What's really interesting, Afifah, is you dive. You mentioned your family members dive as well. You're super comfortable in the water. And I imagine that came in handy on this trip. And I read somewhere that you were snorkeling for an hour or so one of those days. What did you see in the water? Are the waters of the Maldives any different from other places that you've been?
Yeah, so there are so many beautiful dive sites in Southeast Asia, which I've been to in Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. And all of these dive sites, they're breathtaking for so very different reasons. But the Maldivian waters, though, I mean, the underwater visibility is so incredible. Crystal clear waters with, you could see 40, 50, 60 meters ahead. We had snorkeled at one of the house reefs near the resort. It's about this 1 kilometer stretch of reef that's just teeming with marine life. So you could see a variety of very colorful fish, just schools of them swimming around you. Turtles, I saw about 3 or 4 about an arm's length away. So it's so beautiful. You know, these corals, they're often known as the rainforest of the sea. It's a very thriving ecosystem. And it was just so peaceful. The water was really calm. I was floating along the surface, looking down, observing the marine creatures going about their daily routines. I almost forgot that I was there to work. I was holding my GoPro and I was like, okay, time for me to film. But one thing I also noticed is that the corals closer to the shore, in the shallower waters where sunlight could reach easily, these corals were losing color. And this is a phenomenon known as coral bleaching. So we were there in May, and that's one of the hottest months in the Maldives. And the approaching summer temperatures were a big concern for the marine biologists there. The El Nino effect was expected to worsen the bleaching, and this would mean that the corals are just slowly dying. So it was sort of weird for me to be confronted with this stark reality that despite the beauty, seeing this slow decline of the corals right before my eyes was this sobering reminder that the impacts of climate change is here.
When I think of Maldives, I think of tourism, of course, and it is a large part of the Maldivian economy, about 25% of GDP. So talking about your experience in the water, you know, how do you get people to keep visiting, but also protect, maybe even improve the environment at the same time? And also, I have to ask this, I don't mean to sound naive, but is snorkeling safe for those reefs?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to snorkeling, it can be safe for the reefs if it's done responsibly. So a lot of the resorts you go to, the tourists will be advised not to touch, just to step on the corals because this can cause damage. So there are often a lot of briefings or guidelines to ensure that visitors know how to enjoy the marine life without harming it. And like you said, tourism is indeed very crucial for the Maldivian economy, but that comes with a responsibility to protect and to preserve the environment. So most of the resorts, if not all of them, in the Maldives have sort of implemented different initiatives to balance tourism and environmental conservation. So they promote a lot of eco-friendly tourist practices like reducing plastic use, managing waste responsibly, but most importantly, something that a lot of the marine biologists tell me is that there's this pressing need to educate tourists on not just how to interact responsibly with marine life, but also about the impacts of climate change, of human development and what it does to the marine ecosystem. And at the end of the day, how all of us can do our small part to perhaps embrace a more sustainable lifestyle to protect the environment we're in. They also have a lot of cool programs that these resorts do with their guests. So for example, you get to plant your own coral structure. That's something I got to do at one of the resorts. So what we would do is we'd fix the corals on this like metal structure, and then we'd go in the water, perhaps like 5-10 meters out from the shore, in waters that are about 2 meters deep, and then like plant this structure in. I did it in May, so it's been a couple of months now, and the marine biologist was telling me that once the structure is more stable in the water, what they're going to do is they're going to put a sign with the CNA logo on it. So that's we're leaving our mark. We're doing our part for the corals there. But let's hear more about these efforts from Emma Keane. She's a marine biologist at Lee Meridian Maldives Resort and Spa.
We collect bits of coral that are broken from the reef and we attach them to a frame so they can regenerate and continue growing instead of dying. And we put the frames in places where there may not be coral already so that it can start to grow a reef there and help the coral reef to stay healthy in this area.
Every time I come across any sort of climate story, I always think about the people, the people whose livelihoods are so dependent on factors that are really out of their control. In your stories, Afifah, you introduce us to a 42-year-old fisherman. I want to ask you, what made you approach him? Why him in particular?
So when I was snorkeling and I was seeing the coral bleaching happen, I knew that these corals no longer provide a safe habitat for small fish. And a lot of these small fish, they're mainly bait fish, which is necessary for fishermen. So when these reef fish die, you no longer have fish in the shallow waters, and these fishermen will then need to venture out into further, deeper, cooler waters. And I really wanted to hear their stories of the challenges that they faced. Ahmad Ashfam, the fisherman I spoke with, was a friend of my contact. He has a very interesting story because he used to be a consultant for big resorts. So he'd be the guy you look for if you wanted to set up a new luxury resort here in the Maldives. But after being in the corporate life for so long, he told me one day he just woke up and said the stress of it all just wasn't worth it. So he left that life and decided to become a fisherman. It's been a couple of years now. He says he's so much happier. He's living life at a much slower pace. He's going out to sea in the morning. He's being in the water for hours. And he says that's the perfect Maldivian life. But over time and over the last couple of years, he says that it has been a little challenging to get a good catch, primarily because of the weather, erratic weather patterns. So let's listen to what he told me.
Now in the olden days, maybe 10 years ago, during the season changes, everybody would go out to the reef edges where they can get good number of fishes. But now it's been affected. We don't see that much number of fishes, and also we see change in the size of the fishes. That is definitely something which we notice due to the climate change.
So we see that climate change has also led to more erratic and extreme weather conditions. And for a lot of the fishermen in the Maldives, that means that every day out at sea is a gamble, right? I spoke with the Fishermen Association in the Maldives, and I asked them, what's being done to sort of protect the livelihoods of these fishermen? What can we do to sort of help them navigate these choppy waters? And they say that nowadays, fishermen, they spend a much longer time out at sea, about a week at minimum. And if the sea is rough, if the weather is bad, then they will have problems returning back to base or their home islands. So what the association does is that it engages with thousands of fishermen in the archipelago, and they equip these fishermen with necessary skills. So they use technology, they train them how to use various softwares, how to collect data, how to analyze it, to identify different clouds, changes to the weather patterns. And this was something that was very useful to help the fishermen navigate.
It makes me sad because I've never been to the Maldives. I'd really like to go, but it's in trouble. And I know you saw very glaring signs when you were there showing how the country is literally disappearing. It's sinking. Can you tell us about the moving shorelines that you saw?
Yeah, so scientists are predicting that if no action is being taken by 2050, 80% of the entire country, more than 1,200 atolls, will be submerged, and the Maldives will disappear. It is a paradise on earth, and in just a matter of a couple of decades, it's no longer going to be there. So I went around a lot of the local islands nearby the capital, Male, and sometimes I just sit down and chat with the locals, have tea with them. And I've asked them, have you seen any impacts of climate change? And they say yes. It's very slow. Sometimes you don't realize it, but if you look back over the years, then it's there, it's happening. We would stand by the waters, and some of the locals would tell me that 20, 30 years ago, the shoreline used to be 100 meters further out. It's now right here where we stand. And they said that erosion is such a real thing. Most people in the Maldives who live in the remote islands, they're all coming to Male because that's where job opportunities are. It's the city. And Male itself isn't very big. I could walk around the entire city in 45 minutes in the whole perimeter of the city. But it's housing nearly 100,000 people on that cramped space. And then there's a threat of the seas enclosing in on that small island. So this is something that is urgent that Maldives needs to deal with.
Yeah, I remember speaking to another correspondent on this podcast, and they visited the Pacific Islands, and they also said one community actually had to move their cemetery because it was being submerged as well. The Pacific Islands, in fact, they're at the center of a geopolitical tug of war between the U.S. and China, and very similar actually with the Maldives, right? There's China, India, the U.S., all vying for its attention. How evident is the presence of Beijing in the Maldives, Afifah?
The Chinese influence in the Maldives is huge. It's very prominent. You can see it all around the Greater Male area, on Male Island, on Hulu Male Island. The locals, the Maldivians, they're very aware of this power tussle between India and China. It's something that's been very pervasive in their domestic politics because this is a narrative that politicians on either side will use, whether you are pro-China or pro-India. And these narratives are featured very heavily in their elections, in their presidential elections last year, in their parliamentary elections in April this year. For the ordinary Maldivians, they are aware of Chinese influence, Indian influence. They're aware of the loans that the government has taken from both of these major powers. And it seemed to me that they have very mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, a lot of them see all of these investments positively, right? You're bringing in infrastructure, you're creating jobs, you're boosting the tourism industry, and locals do believe that these projects can modernize the country and improve their standards of living. But at this point, the country's economy is not doing well. And so the primary concern for a lot of the people there is, of course, bread and butter issues. It's a small nation of about 500,000 people. They have no natural resources to trade. They can only rely on their traditional economic pillars, tourism, fishing, tax revenues. So people are concerned about the long-term implications of such high level of debt to foreign powers, whether it be China or India or, by extension, the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned loans, you mentioned debt. And we know so far the Maldives has borrowed some $1.5 billion from Chinese banks. That's not a small sum. Where is that money being spent, and how would you describe this relationship? Some are saying the Maldives has actually walked into a debt trap.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. I think China is the biggest foreign lender to the Maldives. They make up 40% of Maldives' foreign debt. Something that I said earlier, the Chinese projects are very visible in the country. You see this iconic Sinamale Bridge. That's a bridge known as the China-Maldives Friendship Bridge that was completed back in 2018. The total cost of just that bridge alone was about $210 million US. It was funded by a grant from the Chinese, about $126 million grant, and the rest of it was a low-interest loan, but a loan nonetheless. The Maldives' relationship with China, just because the Maldives government's foreign policy has always been swaying depending on who's in power. In this round, President Mohammad Muizzu, he is known to be a very strong supporter of China. He won on this India Out campaign back in 2023, and the first trip he made as the president of the country was to China in January. He signed 20 agreements in Beijing, ranging from economic partnerships, military partnerships, more grants, more infrastructure development in the Greater Malay area. And we also know that he has a very good relationship with President Xi. His ties with India strained a little bit. It's back on the mend for now, but it seemed to observers also that President Muizzu was leaning towards a more China-friendly relationship. And fun fact, actually, both President Muizzu and President Xi, they share the same birthday on 15th June, and they wished each other on social media. I was noticing it last month.
That's interesting.
To describe more about this relationship between China and the Maldives, here is Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for the Institute of South Asian Studies, Amit Nendu Palit.
That concern is China now looking at Maldives as one of the options where it can, quote unquote, dump a lot of its excess capacity into infrastructure projects. So I think these are concerns that will remain for some time. The revenues have not started materializing. The investment returns have not started flowing. Infrastructure investments, as it is, take time to deliver returns. The question is, for how long?
So from all this, it sort of sounds like China is winning this tug of war between China and India. And you mentioned this India Out campaign. Where does this growing hostility come from?
Traditionally, India has been a close ally of the Maldives because of proximity, because of long-standing socio-cultural ties. And the Maldives had often relied on India as a security provider and a first responder in that sense. This relationship will continue, but because different governments have always had a different foreign policy, switching between the two powers, India and China, we saw that last year, before the elections happened, and slightly after the elections happened, there was a sign of a spat between India and Maldives, where President Muizzu had lightly referenced India as a bully of the smaller countries in that region. And this led to the call for the removal of Indian troops from Maldivian soil. It does seem that tensions have sort of cooled down. Dr. Muizzu's administration is rebalancing its foreign position. He was there at Prime Minister Narendra Modi's swearing-in ceremony. He was seated right next to Mr. Modi at the banquet after, and this seems to be a strong sign of improving ties between the two.
Okay, now we have to talk about the U.S. We have seen Washington also make attempts to cozy up to the Maldives, describing the island state as a, quote, important partner. Why is winning Malay's affections so important to Washington specifically?
Well, for one, the Maldives is situated along key maritime routes in the Indian Ocean. A significant portion of the world's oil shipments and global trades pass through these routes. And what observers are saying is that controlling or having influence over this region is crucial, and that's why the major powers fighting for Maldives to be an ally. For China, for example, it needs Maldives' cooperation to secure its energy supplies, its trade routes, and especially part of its broader maritime Silk Road Initiative, or under the BRI. For India, and by extension the United States, it's all about regional security. And so for the United States, it needs to build stronger ties with the Maldives to counter China's growing influence in that region. We saw the Maldives foreign minister visiting Washington just about a month and a half ago, and they extended their ties, and they said that they would deepen cooperation in many different areas, including climate change, for example. But let's listen to one of the analysts, Aina Tenhan, a senior fellow at Taihe Institute.
There's a narrative out there that somehow China is doing evil plotting In actuality, from Beijing's point of view, it's the U.S. and its desire to contain China, which is causing a lot of the issues. There isn't a strategic interest, except not forcing it into the hands of the United States or having it be used. You have AUKUS and you have the Quad, and they're very intent on containing China. China wants to have friendly relations, and they also want these countries to do well. From Xi's point of view, a shared future for mankind includes trying to help those who are less fortunate, as they have done in China, by eradicating extreme poverty.
And before we go, one of my favorite parts of this podcast is when correspondents share experiences that they had when they were out in the field that maybe didn't make their final reports on TV and online. So Afifah, what moment didn't make it to your stories? What was the most memorable part of this assignment for you?
When I was planning to go to the Maldives, I thought that it was just going to be a fun time, soaking in the sun, sand, and sea. And the first few days it was, because we were doing the climate change part of it, and we were traveling around different resorts. And that was luxury resorts, so I was having a ball of a time. But when we got to Malé, weather patterns started changing. And for some reason, the moment we hit Malé, it was just raining heavily day after day. It was massive, thunderstorms. And the city was flooded. Water would go up to the middle of my calf.
Wow.
And so a lot of our plans had to change. We were supposed to go to this model island called Kudafari, and it's like a domestic flight and then a seaplane ride out and then a speedboat ride out. But at that point, we had to cancel our trip there because the authorities had issued an amber warning because there was a big storm that was approaching that area where Kudafari was at. So we had to cancel it. And I was so bummed at first because sometimes it'd be so hot in the day, and then after that it's massive downpour, and then flooding would happen. And locals were telling me that it wasn't something that happened a couple of years ago. And I was bummed, but at the same time, I said, this is what climate change is about. But another very interesting experience that I had was that on our ride back from one of the luxury resorts, we took a 45-minute speedboat back to Malé. And when we were nearing Malé, about 5-10 minutes away, the boat suddenly stopped. And then the captain was like, "Come out, guys, everyone come out and look." And then we came out to the deck and we saw dozens of dolphins, and these
dozens.
Yeah, there were I think there were 60 dolphins, honestly.
What?
And these dolphins were about 1.5 meters maybe in length, so they weren't really big ones. But can you imagine there were 60 of them, pods of them, just about 5 different pods of them. And then there was one particular pod, about 5-6 dolphins. They were literally under our boats, and then they were just peeking out, and then some of them were jumping out of the water and twirling in the air. And it was so close. And I've seen dolphins while diving before, but this experience was just so amazing. And the boat captain was actually saying it could be that the dolphins were being chased out of their homes, on their habitats from somewhere else, and then, having to come here. So it's good in the sense that people can then see these dolphins. It's also bad that the dolphins are now more familiar with human life, human development, and,
Right.
that could put them in a very vulnerable position.
Well, it took you 15 years, but you made it to the Maldives. Great catching up, Afifah. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Teresa.
Afifah's series of reports on the Maldives are all up on YouTube, so make sure you check it out. Also, head to cna.asia. And a reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert Craigdale, and myself, Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.